In this mini lecture, let's talk a little bit about defenses, ego defenses, social defenses, however you would like to call them. And ego defenses are a pretty amazing thing from my point of view. They're extremely amazing because, like defenses do, they protect us from external pressure that is probably crashing onto us, that is putting a burden onto our shoulders, especially as a leader. And this is why they're extremely helpful. But they also come with a problem. Ego defenses mostly are unconscious. So you don't know that you're defending yourself, which again is a pretty good thing because as you breathe, you don't want to think that you have to breathe. So it's quite autonomous. The problem with defenses is if they're kicking in too early, if they protect you too early, then they're like an immune system that is creating an allergy. Your immune system thinks it has to protect you. The defenses think that they have to protect you, but they're actually limiting you in your daily life as a leader. And in this session, let's take a look at what defenses are. And afterwards, I invite you to reflect a little bit what your defenses are, because we all have them and they're perfectly normal for a healthy development. And at the same time, they can be risky. So without further ado, let's go right into it and take a look at a couple of slides. And like I said, this is a beautiful picture from my point of view with the lady wearing a mask, how defenses can protect you and how they can serve you well in daily life. And like this picture shows probably what you all know during the corona pandemic, the mask is protecting you from external things that might harm you. And I don't know if you have realized it, but I have been way less sick during the time when I was wearing a mask. And I was constantly wearing a mask during, I realized, hey, I don't have hay fever anymore. And that was because of the mask I was wearing, and it was protecting me from the allergens that would come through and trigger the hay fever. So it was actually supporting my immune system. And the same is true for me for ego defenses. They are basically like the mask you are wearing to protect yourself from things of the outer world that might actually harm you. At the same time, it's sometimes good to play a bit in the dirt, like my parents used to say. I grew up in an environment where I played a lot outside and I was constantly playing in the dirt, and that actually helped me, and that helped to train my immune system. So it's a two-edged sword. In one way, defenses are protecting you. From another perspective, if they are kicking in too early and if they are protecting you too much, it can probably be harmful and your immune system is not being trained. And you might be wondering how that looks like in real life. And one pretty good example for me is if you are familiar with the healthcare industry, if you are working with doctors or nurses. And sometimes there is so much emotional pressure, a burden of the job that is on their shoulders, that they are using defenses to protect themselves from this stress. If they, for example, have a patient in a room and he or she is very sick and they don't say that this patient Mr. XYZ, they sometimes say it's the liver in room 3. So they depersonalize this person by calling him or her the liver in room 3. Everyone knows what they're talking about, and at the same time, they're not talking about an actual person, which can help them to deal with the stress of the profession. So that's a beautiful example for a good defense, I would say. But we also sometimes have escalating defenses. Escalating defenses become a problem because, like I said in my intro, defenses are unconscious. And if they're kicking in too early, and if you're using them just as a reflex, which most defenses are used as, and if they're too strong, if these boundaries that you create around you, if the defenses are too high and kicking in too well, they can be, from my point of view, like an immune system that is actually turning against you, like the hay fever example in the beginning. So be careful if your defenses are not serving you very well. The problem is that is easy said, but difficult to be done. So be careful that your defenses are serving you well. So if it would be so easy, why are we not doing it? And the answer is pretty simple. Defenses are mostly unconscious. And if we think about something like the Johari window, we do not have access, in most cases, to our unconsciousness. So we have to work with that a little bit. We have to observe ourselves a little bit. And what might be helpful is if we look at specific defenses later on. So let's take a look about when defenses actually kick in. And they kick in if we feel anxiety. And anxiety to me is different than fear. Fear is directed to something very specific. So you can be afraid of spiders, for example, with it, which is quite common. So people are afraid of a spider. Anxiety is more like a diffuse feeling. You don't feel very well. You feel tense. You are anxious. It is not specifically directed towards something, or you don't want to avoid something specifically in most cases. And as a leader, I would say it is extremely likely that you are creating anxiety if you are triggering change, for example. So if you ask people to follow you towards a new strategy through a change process. So the business world is full of anxiety to be able to fulfill the role, which is another interesting topic that we might have to cover. Anxiety to show others that you're doing a good job, actually, whatever that means. It's a fantasy, which is another topic we have to discuss, and so on and so forth. So I would say that anxiety is quite common in the workplace. And if you're wondering if that is actually true, I invite you to take a minute and think about your last week where you were working. Probably it was a fun week. Probably it was a very successful week. But probably some of you have also experienced insecurity, stress, some kind of anxiety, maybe to fulfill the role demands or whatever that might be. Don't go too deep into that. Let's go back to defenses, even if you haven't felt anxiety, which I hope you haven't done. So where does it come from, this anxiety and these defenses? It seems like defenses are quite a very old thing. They were already discussed in the Japanese culture. And sometimes you probably have seen these three animals, the three monkeys, which one doesn't see, so it's covering its eyes. One doesn't hear anything. And the last one is keeping the mouth shut, which is also, by the way, an interesting topic when we have to talk about organizational silence and our ability, or should we say inability, to give feedback. So sometimes these three are complemented by a fourth one, and it's holding its belly, which says, don't feel anything, which seems to be quite true for most Western cultures where we were trained, and probably you are also trained at the university or in your profession, not to talk about feelings and not to access your feelings that well, which is, again, a very positive thing and also a negative thing, which can impact you in a negative way. So this is the basic idea of defenses. Don't see things that are problematic, don't hear things that are problematic, and don't talk about things that probably are problematic. So defenses probably sound negative as far as you might think now after the picture with the 3 monkeys, but defenses are absolutely normal to a healthy development. You need them. You need defenses because they protect you. The problem is they have to match your personal development phase. So like if you're a kid, a 5-year-old kid, and if you have kids, you probably know that, they sometimes cover their eyes and think if you don't, or if I don't see you, you don't see me, which is obviously not a very healthy thing to do for someone in the mid-40s. So defenses are good, they're helpful if they are mature and match the situation and personal developmental phase. And like I said, ego defenses are unconscious strategies to deal with internal and external pressures when the environment is not containing. Containing means that it protects you, basically. That's the idea of a containing or so-called holding environment. So every time the environment is not holding anymore, and on the slide you see or the caregiver, you start to defend yourself. The caregiver in that case is your leader, your direct manager, your boss. So if you think that your boss, or have the feeling that your boss is not protecting you, whatever that means in that case, it doesn't obviously mean that he or she is standing behind you with a sword. It's just like psychological safe environment. Then ego defenses unconsciously kick in and protect you against the pressures that threat your self-esteem or the structure of yourself, of self. And that means that you basically want to maintain a stable picture of yourself. You want to be seen and see yourself as a good person, whatever that means from your point of view. It can be very different if 2 different people look at the question, what is good and what is bad. That's another philosophical discussion, probably. So the goal of your defenses is to protect you, to maintain a stable self, and to restore, if that is necessary, or to maintain your emotional well-being. And as a leader, if you see that someone is using defenses, and you hopefully will see these defenses after this very brief mini lecture about defenses, you might be tempted to intervene and tell the people, hey, look, this is a defense that you're using right now, but be careful. Leave the defense to the people who are using them. Don't take them away by showing them, hey, this is what you're doing, stop doing it. To me, it's like comparable to pull down their pants from behind. And you shouldn't do that, obviously. The only reason when it makes sense to intervene is when these defenses are so amplified, when they're shown in situations where you would deem them inappropriate to the development or the situations, and usually as a result impact performance goals of a particular member of your team. So otherwise, leave the people, the defense, just observe them and remember they're healthy and they're necessary. Now let's take a look about how defenses become apparent. And that's probably quite a complex picture, but don't worry about that too much. Let's start on the lower right side with the globe, where we experience an event in the outer world. And we will talk about events again when we talk about irrational beliefs, where we will talk about so-called activating events. So something is happening, and the activating events, we will call them kind of a buzzer, like in a game show. There is people there ask a question and they have to hit a buzzer, and the buzzer is creating a noise and it's usually triggering something. So think about the event as some kind of a buzzer, and the buzzer, the trigger, is something that we will get back to on this slide. So every time you are doing something in the world, in your professional role, let's focus on that. everything that you see, everything that you hear is going through certain filters. And these filters are shaped by your socialization, by your experiences, probably by your culture, and also by attachment patterns. So experience and attachment patterns are the two major influences of the filters that you possess. Attachment patterns, just to briefly mention them, they are the relationship, more or less, that you have developed to your mother. In most cases, it's still the mother that you have been attached to. And that's another interesting topic to discuss, but the relationship that you have developed to your mother can either be very stable and secure because the caregiver, in that case your mother, has created a holding environment and you had a beautiful childhood where you are able to explore things, to do things, and it was okay to take risks. Or you have had a rather stressful childhood without knowing it, probably. So you were very much attached to your mother and you were afraid when she would leave you because that would create uncertainty and anxiety. And again, this is very unconscious because obviously as a child, you do not remember the attachment pattern, the specific attachment pattern you have developed. So the overarching topic here is unconsciousness. So your filters are unconsciously developed in most cases. And if things are experienced, they go through your filter, and then it might be possible that someone or something has hit a buzzer. So something is triggering you. For example, one of my personal triggers is, I'm going to share that, if someone tells me, you are not working hard enough. That is really literally kicking me off, or at least it did for a couple of years. And what this trigger is doing compared to the game show, you will hear a sound that is buzzing. You will feel an impulse, and this impulse usually is connected to a regression. So you act, like I said, based on the attachment pattern that you have learned, like a 5-year-old. So you act like you have learned it to act, to protect yourself as a kid. So you regress into your younger self. And that is not as nice as it might be at times, because you are showing strange behaviors. Obviously, you are not throwing yourself on your back, starting to cry and yell in the middle of the meeting room. This anxiety is contained and you socially adapt to what is more or less appropriate. And this appropriate behavior often is a defense. Defenses are basic assumptions about how you should have to act, to behave, and to protect in this situation. So you feel the impulse, you regress, you show a defense. And often the defense is compromising. So you bring the regression from the past into the here and now, into the meeting room. And that can be compromising. It can help you as a defense to protect you, but at the same time, it can be problematic if important things don't get through and if you stay in the regression. And there are two options. Either you reconnect with your impulse, you realize, there is this guy looking at me, telling me I don't work hard enough, and usually this will kick off my defense because I feel an impulse, I have a bad feeling, I feel anxiety, I regress, and now I use the defense probably to rationalize that and to explain him why I'm working hard enough. So that would be a good thing, to reconnect with your feelings, to rationalize, to bring it into your rational realm, to think about, okay, what's happening right now? And then you can deal with it. The problem is the other route, if you take that. So if you sit with your feelings, if you don't think about them, and by the way, feelings and rationality, they're connected. It is not either or, because sometimes you hear people talking about feelings more often or logic more often. And this split, this disconnections of feeling and logic, that's not a very good thing from my point of view. By the way, splitting can be another defense. I would say it's a maladaptive response to stress, but that would be, again, another topic. And that's a problem if you split that, if you just sit with your impulse, if you sit in your regression and just let the defense take over. So the basic idea is to make this slide, to bring this slide in a nutshell, to become aware when you regress, when you show a defense, and especially to become aware about what is triggering you. You don't have to go back to your early childhood and talk about, okay, why did that happen? What did my mother do? Or whatever happened there. Just leave it where it is. Be aware of the trigger in the first place. So that is a very important thing, to get to know your triggers. And obviously, you will know your trigger if someone is hitting the button. So it's actually quite good sometimes to be in stressful situations. And also, it is good, like probably I've told you or asked you, to sit with your frustration. If you experience frustration, that can be a quite good indicator about potential triggers that are there. So let's take a look at some of the defenses, because I mentioned them a couple of times, but we never took a look at defenses. And before we do that, let's talk about coping strategies as something contrary to defense mechanism. Probably that's also a good thing before we dive deeper into specific defenses. So defense mechanisms, like I said, they're unconscious. And coping strategies are very conscious efforts to decrease negative effect. For example, a coping effect or coping strategy that I use is usually I like to work out. If I have stress at my job, I like to work out. And this is a coping strategy for me. And you might have different coping strategies to decrease negative effect. For example, I know a friend, he says he likes to be in his car after a long day at work, because this transition from work to home actually gives him time to think about things, to decompress and arrive home more relaxed. Defenses are not conscious, while coping strategies are conscious and carried out with the intent to solve or manage a problematic situation. When we look at a defense, there is no conscious intention because it's unconscious. And the defense has an internal focus, which does not necessarily have an effect on the external reality. So you don't necessarily need to change or want to change external reality. And sometimes, and this is problematic for you as a leader, you don't see if someone is using defenses. And that makes it obviously problematic if you want to assess if someone of your team members is using it or not. Well, coping strategies, again, are a different thing. There is the focus on external reality with the aim to return to baseline functioning as quickly as possible. So you decompress, you try to get back to your normal state. And that is the same with defenses, but again, it's unconscious, and it is quite likely that reality is tweaked a little bit. And the technical term here is reality distortion, and that doesn't happen during a coping strategy. So reality distortion is when you see reality differently. So probably like with your income tax declaration, some of you might know that depending on the country where you live and work in, you have to make an income statement declaration once a year usually. And reality distortion would be to consciously force it out of your awareness and pretend it doesn't exist. I have a lot of time, just as one example. So finally, let's go into the defenses and talk about what defenses are. And I said They can be very helpful if they match the situation and your personal state of development. So obviously, a 5-year-old kid has different defenses compared to a 40-year-old person. And on the left side, you see mature defenses, and they're perfectly all right, good to have them. You see neurotic defenses, intermediate defenses, and I would dare to say that we are using them as well quite often in the business world. What we hopefully don't see that often are immature or even psychotic defenses. Even if I would here also dare to say that some of the psychotic defenses, like denial, for example, you might be tempted to see them, but I would say from a psychological point of view, people in the business, in the corporate world, they usually don't deny things. Sometimes they tend to do, but it's more kind of a rationalization, intellectualization, and something like that. So you will probably never be faced with psychotic defenses, even more likely a bit with immature. But let's go through them. So let's start with the mature defenses on top of the slide. Mature defenses, and I invite you to think about what kind of defenses have you seen in yourself or maybe in others. And I love to start with humor, for example. Humor is quite an interesting defense for me because I'm using it quite a lot. Every time I am in stressful situations, I tend to crack a joke, to make fun, to relieve the tension. And I used to say that this is important for the group because I want to cheer up the group. But actually, it is more important for me. So if I feel the stress that is in the group, if I feel the group is tensed up, I like to crack a joke to relieve the tension for me. And I'm just thinking that is important for the group, but actually it's an important thing for me. And you probably know people who like to make jokes and to be the life of the meeting and stuff like that. And it can be a good thing. It can also be a defense. And the same is true if a group of professionals sitting around a table is in a meeting that is quite stressful, and somehow they burst out in a laugh. And that can be extremely stress relieving. So every time a group is starting to laugh, let's take a look at that and think about, okay, is it because it's really a fun session, which obviously can happen, that would be nice, or is it a sign that there is tension in the group that has to be relieved? So humor alone is quite an interesting thing. Sublimation is another one that is quite interesting and that you see in the management field quite often, so that people start running. They have energy and they redirect energy to something else. So they work out. The problem here is if sublimation and if energy is redirected to someone else, which means that the leader gets pressure from the level above him or her. So if you're a leader and your boss is putting pressure on you and you are redirecting this pressure, this energy to your employees, and you are putting pressure onto them and yelling at them again. So you think that the stress on you is relieved by simply putting it onto someone else. And obviously that does work in a way if you start running and working out. But in the other way, if you redirect the pressure, it obviously doesn't work. Suppression, that was one of the examples I told you with the income tax declaration. It can be quite a mature thing that you consciously force things out of your awareness, and that can be helpful for a while, but you all know it will get you earlier or later, so you have to deal with that. Let's take a look at the neurotic defenses. Those are also quite common, I would probably say, if I read through the list in the business world. If people tend to intellectualize things, if they rationalize things, I have to do it because of these or that reasons. So that's something that you will probably see quite often in the business world. And undoing is something else that I probably have seen a couple of times. So you do something bad to someone, probably not intentionally, and then you see that it had a negative impact on someone, and then you try to undo that. Sometimes in the private world, you see it that someone is bringing flowers home to say sorry for something, and that is basically some kind of undoing. Another problematic thing I would say here is somatization. Somatization is if you physically feel your body is reacting to pressure, like you're getting a weak stomach, you cannot sleep very well, you start to sweat, and these type of things. They can be okay. I mean, sweating is not that bad, probably. But if you're getting problems with your stomach or if your blood pressure is rising, that can be quite problematic. Like some of the others, reaction formation doing exactly the opposite, like homophobia is one, I would say, negative way of showing a defense. Or if you repress things, if you unconsciously block unpleasant thoughts. If you consciously block them, maybe that's helpful in a way for a time, but it's not very good on the long run. Immature defenses, like I said, quite unlikely, except I would say projection. And that is something that you will see quite often. You project something onto someone else, which basically means that you put something on others that you have in yourself. Think about it as a projector, like a TV projector, like a movie projector. So you have this little device in yourself, you have it sitting in your chest, so to speak, and suddenly the lights go up and they project a picture, this time not onto a wall, but onto another person. So you project something of your inner world onto someone else. And a beautiful example for that is if you metaphorically point with a finger at someone. So now try to do it. Point with a finger at the screen. And what you will see is obviously the finger is pointing at the screen. So I'm projecting something at the screen. I say this person is mean, is evil, whatever negative things you want to project on this person on the screen. And now the tricky thing. Usually you should have 3 fingers pointing backwards and they're pointing back at you. So 1 finger is pointing at the screen and 3 fingers are pointing back at you. So every time you criticize something in others, you probably criticize something that you have in yourself. And by the way, probably your thumb is going up. So 1 finger is pointing at the person, 3 fingers are pointing at you, and 1 finger, the thumb, is pointing upwards into the bad environment. But very often, if you project something, try to look into yourself. So if you criticize something at others, I encourage you to think about, might be that you see yourself in the other person. So projections are probably one very, very huge topic that we might have to talk about in another session again. Autistic fantasies, daydreaming, we probably all had that, but not in a very dramatic way. And sometimes it's actually a good thing if you suddenly wake up in a meeting and realize, oh, where were we? That's basically daydreaming, and that can be a defense, but I wouldn't worry about that too much. Acting out, obviously, probably you don't see that in the business world except drinking or drug abuse maybe. So I know a couple of people who started to drink when they had a lot of pressure at work, who started to use drugs mostly to be more performant at work. And that's a defense, again, obviously a dramatic one, I would say, for the person. Devaluation is another interesting thing for me, especially if we talk about leadership and management, about this comparison that some people make. I think it's an unhealthy differentiation to make. It's usually devaluating management at times because they just manage things, and sometimes the leader is seen as the glorified person. And that's a negative defense from my point of view. If you devaluate management and glorify leadership, then you're looking for the glorified leader, for the mother that is protecting you, for the great father who is protecting you. That is if you long for great leaders. But at the same time, it can also be that leadership is devaluated and management is raised, and that management is really favored. And this is also problematic because people think it's the magic of the technique. If they just focus on the processes and the guidelines, that this will save you. That is kind of so-called golden fantasy. If you just do one thing, all of your problems will be solved. So that is devaluating idealization and splitting in one thing. And that's usually a tricky thing if you devaluate one thing and idealize another thing. So you see that these defenses are quite manifold. And to put some water in the wine, the research about defenses is quite limited. And in the diagnostic manual, in the statistics manual, the DSM, it's mixed somehow. They were in one version and then they were excluded in another version. So don't put too much research, or don't idealize these defenses too much, because you see them here and there is some research on that. Don't devaluate them because there is not enough research on it. So I would invite you to take a look at the list. Don't see it as kind of a checkbox and say, okay, if I show something, it's good, or if I show something, it's bad. Don't see the list that way. Just take it as an idea and think about triggers and think about defenses that you use. Like I said, I like to use humor. This is one of my, let's say, favorite standard defenses. And once you do it consciously, once you pull this unconscious defense into your consciousness, you can deal with it. And that's the good thing. Don't try to get rid of your defenses. Maintain them, probably nurture them, but do this in a reflected manner, in a reflected way. And every time you use a defense, it can be a good indicator that something is really putting stress onto you, that you're really under pressure, and probably it's possible to use a coping strategy to get rid of this type of pressure. And that was, in a bigger nutshell, some thoughts about defenses, ego defenses, and social defenses that you might be faced with, that you might encounter either in yourself or in a group you are working with.